I think I figured out one of humankind's biggest problems. I know that might sound like a joke, because it is a big claim. I acknowledge that, okay? And I'm just some random millennial on the internet. What do I know? But just hear me out and then decide whether or not you agree, okay? I like to think about things. I listen to ideas a lot. I'm very curious by nature, always wanting to learn and find out about other perspectives and all kinds of stuff. I like to reason through things for myself. I don't just listen and then go, okay, I'll do the thing that he said. No, I like to listen to people, to dissect it, to figure out, does that actually make sense? Where do pieces fit into place? And are there other factors that could be contributing to making it seem like a different conclusion could be drawn from this than what would accurately describe the situation, right? So I like to apply logic and reason to things to figure out what's really going on. I like to get to the bottom of things, okay? So I listen to ideas a lot, and I like to share my ideas and then listen to the feedback, because I think that's how we learn and grow and improve, which is what I really want to do throughout my life. So in light of all that, I'm always trying to think about all the things I learn and see what fundamental core lessons can be learned from patterns. That's really interesting to me. So for a long time, I've been learning things about the world that have led me to the conclusion that I think one of humankind's biggest problems is seeing people as groups rather than as individuals. I think that's very, very significant. A lot of problems with a lot of different movements and atrocities and conflicts in many situations around the world, I have been pretty decided for a while now, really boil down to this issue of looking at people as groups rather than individuals, which it's not a logically tenable position. It's not consistent. It's not fair or just in any way, and creates a lot of injustice and a lot of other problems by looking at people as groups. And I've already made videos talking about that. But today I was watching a video called The Growing Rift Between Young Men and Women from Nick Freitas's YouTube channel. I really like Nick Freitas, very cool guy, very respectable, very respectful, and very reasonable and articulate. I think he has very good character. I really admire Nick Freitas, excuse me. Very cool guy. And in this really good discussion, they're talking about so many different things. The title is about the rift between young men and women that is growing across the world. That's a topic I've talked about quite a bit too. Really, we have one culture now. Cultures are not nearly as divided now as they were throughout history. Because of the internet and so much of the technological age, we are very connected, and our culture is really merging into one. And they do some data analysis showing how that's very much the case. A lot of cultural trends are happening around the world. In this case, that those cultural trends are actually taking young men and young women further apart ideologically and politically. And it's a really fascinating discussion, but they actually talk about a lot of different things. I'm only 55 minutes in. They've covered history of feminism and Marxism and the Soviet Union. They've talked about so many different things. And something that came up a few times during this discussion was this issue of always growing list of things to complain about to keep a movement going, which is another thing that I have noticed myself and have talked about over the years with several people. And it is really fascinating. Like with feminism specifically, you have feminism originally being tied to giving women the right to vote. Now you have the right to vote, but feminism continues and just takes on new forms. And okay, now it's about different things, and we want this and we've got that. Now we want this, now we've got that, now we want this. But it's not exclusive to feminism, of course, in the grand scheme of things, but even in the context of the video's discussion, they actually talk about this with some other ideologies as well. And that is something I've always noticed. So I started thinking, why is that these ideological movements always have another demand? Something that I noticed that I think really kind of elucidates what's going on with a lot of political ideologies throughout history all over the world, and which even lies at the heart of this issue I've been talking about so much for quite a while, of seeing people as groups rather than as individuals. I think this is an even deeper level of that. For example, something as an American, something that really interests me a lot is the differences between political ideologies on the right and left, conservative, liberal, Democrat and Republican, I was always curious, what are the main differences, the big things at the heart of the issue that really differentiate someone who's more on the right versus someone who's more on the left? And there were several things I used to point to, but then I kept, the more I thought about this over the years and the more I observed, my understanding kept zeroing in on like a fundamental distinction. And there are a couple, but one of the big ones is The right tends to see more in the terms of people are individuals with their own character and values and choices. And on the left, it tends to be more of people are just a sum of a whole, just groups, really. And you define them by a label, not by who they are as an individual. But I think what I realized while thinking about this discussion where Nick Freitas and his colleagues here were discussing history of feminism and how that movement kept having a new thing to be complaining about or trying to get resolved. And they touched on the fact that even though a lot of the times there are legitimate problems that are being addressed in the start of the movement, like with the, first wave of feminism being associated with the right to vote, like women did not have the right to vote. And so it's a totally understandable thing you want to get resolved, right? And how these legitimate problems actually grow into movements that are no longer trying to solve legitimate problems, but even when there is no legitimate problem, still die hard claiming that there is one and coming up with the most extreme, sometimes crazy solutions for the alleged problems, where it just really gets out of hand and kind of snowballs into some kind of other monster. And at the heart of this, what came to mind for me is I think that possibly the basis of this problem has roots in, or is at the very least extremely closely tied to, the notion of linking one's sense of identity with an external thing. So I think this is an even more fundamental layer. I think I've kind of reached another level down in my understanding of the problems of humankind, even deeper than the issue of seeing people as groups, because I think this might be kind of the core of that, and it expands out from there. And how I connected it with what they were talking about in this discussion is, let's say you identify yourself as a feminist. Like, that's my identity. That's who I am as a feminist. That's something I thought I'd never say. And so you're in 1918 or something, and you're like, okay, I'm a feminist, that's who I am, and that's totally justified because women need the right to vote. So then women get the right to vote. Now, who am I, right? Who am I? It's like my whole identity was riding on being a feminist. The feminist movement can't die because then I'm nothing. What do I have? My identity is linked to feminism, so feminism has to survive. Feminism was about bringing about the right to vote for women. Well, they have that now, so now we need something new. And so you come along and you search for problems. And if your identity is at its core so deeply linked to this purpose of driving this movement forward, you have to find some way to keep the movement going. You have to find another purpose to continue to justify the existence of feminism and find some way to connect it to the original purpose, if possible, so that you feel like you haven't lost your sense of identity. So even in a situation where your ideology is associated directly with a problem that no longer exists, even if there really are no problems right now that directly tie to what the movement was originally about or is supposed to be about or hypothetically is about, you have to look for anything you can skew in a way where you can create a problem out of it to justify your movement, because justifying the movement justifies the label, which validates your sense of identity. In the discussion Nick Freitas and the others were having, they also touched on the civil rights movement. A way I can relate this concept to that is, civil rights movement, you have obviously very significant racial problems. They talked about the Jim Crow era, laws enforcing segregation and forcing people with dark skin to have lesser place in society, to have to use less maintained facilities and stuff like that. So you have a very significant problem where people are being treated horribly for something they can't control. So now you have the proper ingredients for a movement to start. There's an actual problem, although there doesn't, just to be clear, that doesn't have to be an actual problem for a movement to start. A lot of times they're based on blatant lies, such as BLM, for example, which really took off because of stuff like hands up, don't shoot, which the people who started that phrase actually later admitted that they made it up and that it was not true at all. So that's an example. You can have a lie start a movement, but as long as people believe that there's a real problem happening, then you can start a movement out of it. Whether there's a real problem or not, once that movement's going, people link their identity to it, and now once the problem's solved, we still have that sense of identity, so we need new problems. And so you have what originally starts as a legitimate civil rights movement, then it's like, okay, Jim Crow laws are done away with, and people are treated equally under the law, and in society as a whole, overall. Of course, there are always going to be individuals who are racist or whatever, but overall, society moved far beyond that for decades. But you still have this sense of identity. We still have to fight for this movement, even though the movement has no reason to exist anymore. So you have to create reasons for it to exist. And so then you go, okay, well, let's look for racism everywhere. So, okay, long time ago, the Republican Party ended slavery, and the Republican Party ended Jim Crow and all these issues. So for a long time now, people have been treated in society overall as equal regardless of their skin color. But you have so many people whose entire identity is strongly associated with the need to fight for racial justice of the oppressed people with dark skin. And so when people with dark skin are no longer oppressed in society, objectively, you have to find ways to pretend that they are. And so you have to come up with increasingly convoluted solutions to these alleged problems. And so you come up with like, okay, well, maybe secretly, people are less likely to hire someone because of the color of their skin, or less likely to get scholarship. So to counter this, we have to have some kind of a solution. Well, when there's no problem, your solution ends up creating a problem. The solution in this case being create more racism. So that's where you get affirmative action, where it's like having certain quotas, or even just being more likely to hire someone who has dark skin, or more likely to hire a woman, or more likely to hire someone who's gay or whatever, when they have the same qualifications, and you're basing it off of the superficial characteristic, the label. You, in some sense, justify yourself. You feel like you're still fighting for a problem that in reality is long dead. But of course, that's not enough. You got to keep going. You got to have a new problem to fight for. So that's where you get to where we are now, where white people are just demonized across the board, talked about as evil. You can say absolutely anything you want about people with light skin, and there are no repercussions whatsoever. And it's all about, giving months to celebrate and all these privileges and benefits where you raise up people who are not white. So it always gets more and more extreme. And of course, by trying to solve a problem that wasn't there, you've created new problems or old problems in new forms, and you've just brought back racism and made a very racist society again. Or let's say you identify yourself, okay, my identity is associated with Islam and being an Arab, okay? So when an Arab Islamic group happens to wipe out a bunch of innocent people, including children in Israel, well, my sense of identity as an Arab and as a Muslim is to go along with whatever other Arabs and Muslims happen to be going along with. So when all the rest just demonize Israel to the point of justifying absolutely anything that could further the goal of destroying Israel, then I have to support that. And that's how you get a lot of people supporting what they otherwise say they're against, including a lot of friends I lost for simply saying all lives matter, for simply valuing all human life, regardless of where people are from, and never justifying terrorism. Lost a lot of friends because they identified so strongly with being Arab and being Muslim that even though for years they had always told me that they don't support terrorism and don't support innocents getting slaughtered, when there was unbelievably staggering amounts of evidence showing blatantly that innocents, including children, were slaughtered, and when it's actually the stated goals of Hamas and has been for decades, that wasn't enough because they weren't ideologically consistent in their views, because really what matters more is they're Muslim and they're Arab, so I have to take their side. And many Muslims told me exactly that. They say, when you criticize one Muslim, you're criticizing us all because we're brothers. There's a horrible way of thinking. And again, I was thinking of that in terms of, well, the problem there is seeing people as groups rather than individuals. And it is, but even more fundamentally than that is this notion of linking your identity, your sense of identity, to something outside yourself. Because external things have nothing to do with who you are. If you're not a member of Hamas, then you are not Hamas. So when Hamas decides to go and do something that you don't agree with, well, now you're in a state of conflict, right? You have this cognitive dissonance that you have to resolve by justifying it in some way. And so these people who had sworn to me for years, no, I would never support innocents being killed, they see innocents get killed and they go, yes, awesome. Wait, what? You said you don't support innocents getting killed. Yeah, well, an Arab did it and a Muslim did it, and I'm an Arab and a Muslim. So, because if you're an individual human being, which every person is, then you are not all Arabs and you are not all Muslims. You're one person. So when another Arab or Muslim does something that you never would have done, well, now you're in that situation where you have to invent some way to justify it. And that only happens if you link your sense of identity with being Arab and being Muslim. So feminism, BLM, leftist anti-white racism, Islam. These are just a few examples, but you can associate this with like any political movement ever, and you could have the same problems arise. This is also nationalism, right? I've long expressed disagreement with other conservatives because most conservatives tend to be pretty patriotic. There's a very fine line between patriotism and nationalism, and a lot of the opinions I've heard from conservatives over the years tend to actually go into nationalistic territory. And then you have like Republican candidates sometimes being extremely nationalistic in their rhetoric, like Vivek Ramaswamy and Donald Trump sometimes. Same thing goes there too. And I've been talking to conservatives about this for years, why you need to stop with that. I've been talking to conservatives about why I am against the Pledge of Allegiance, because it makes absolutely no sense to link your sense of identity with something outside yourself. In the case of nationalism, that's your country, right? So if you were a good citizen of Germany and you liked what Germany was, and the 1940s roll around and Germany goes down a very dark path and the leaders of Germany start doing horrible, horrible things, if you have pledged allegiance to the flag, if your whole sense of identity is whatever German leadership does, then I guess that's good, then the Holocaust comes around and you're now supporting absolutely horrible things that a few years prior you wouldn't have. So under all this, nationalism, racism, and so many other tribalistic conflicts, at the core of it is, seeing people as groups rather than individuals, which is very problematic, but even more deeply into the core than that is the notion of linking your sense of identity with external sources. Because you're not the country, you're not your movement, you are not feminism, you are not all Arabs, you're not whatever, you are one person. And these big movements and groups that are just social constructs are made up of millions and millions of individuals who think differently. So a lot of them think differently than you. And whatever happens to become the majority way of thinking about it within the movement, at some point in time, that's the direction the movement will go. And so if you're going to be a cowardly conformist follower that just goes wherever the movement takes you, like you're sitting in a lazy river at a water park, you will end up bringing about all the same problems that you swore to be so against, because the movement will change without you. The solution to this is simply viewing identity as something that makes a whole heck of a lot more sense, which is your identity is about you, not about some label associating yourself with something outside yourself that you have no control over. Not only does this make a whole heck of a lot more logical sense, since you're talking about yourself now when linking to your identity, but it's also extraordinarily liberating, because you're not chained to a movement that might take off without you in a direction you never intended for it to go. Because unlike a movement or a nation or a race, when it comes to yourself, you have a lot of control. Not complete control. We can't control everything our minds or bodies do, but you have a lot of control. You can choose who to be. You can choose how to react to situations to a degree, to a pretty significant degree. You can choose what kinds of sources you put into your life, whether you're getting positive input or negative input. You get to choose how to treat people. My sense of identity is simply who I choose to be. It's what values, timeless values that won't just suddenly get off and go crazy one day, like valuing truth and logical reasoning and compassion for those who are hurting, compassion for victims. See, if your moral sense of identity is associated with, well, what's bad is when Muslims get hurt, when Arabs get hurt, and only when they get hurt by Israel or America or something, rather than when they get hurt by other Muslims and Arabs, then what happens is you're only going to have compassion for those people in those circumstances. But if your moral system is built on, no, just when people in general, when human beings get hurt, or even when living creatures get hurt, you feel compassion. You just end up being a hypocrite at that point. But what's much more consistent and what's actually moral and just is like, I don't care where the person is from, because where the person's from has nothing to do with whether or not someone is innocent and whether or not someone is worthy of compassion. So what makes more sense is you think, if a person gets hurt, I'm going to care about that person. If people are being victimized and they're innocent, they deserve support and help no matter which country they were born in. And then when you see some other people who happen to be Arabs or Muslims and they kill a bunch of innocent people in Israel, you're like, oh, those are innocent people. And that's how you're seeing it, because you haven't polluted your mind with a worldview that's based on these superficial things. And so you get to be a much better person when your sense of identity is based on moral values that don't change, that apply to any situation. Like wherever an innocent is, I care about innocence. Whatever narrative is being taught, I'm going to oppose it if it's lies, if it's manipulation. You know, even though I'm conservative, the term is not accurate, but even though I'm considered a conservative in terms of modern American politics, I call out conservatives plenty. I already mentioned how I disagree with patriotism and nationalism, but also when conservatives are lying, when conservatives are manipulating information, clipping things to make it look like someone on the left said something they didn't say, it ticks me off. I call them out on it. Why? Because my sense of identity isn't being a conservative. I happen to be a conservative because or considered a conservative because those values happen to align with my own, but my sense of identity has nothing to do with it. And so I'm perfectly happy calling out other conservatives, because my sense of identity is about what's right and what's wrong, what's true and what's false. And that's what I care about. You know, it's not the label. I care about the value, because these values will never change. The concept of truth is a constant. What particular facts happen to be true at a given moment in time, that changes, of course, but the concept of truth doesn't. Something is either true or it's false. If something is real, factual, it is true. And if your value system is built on, like, I need to know what things are true and I'm going to reject lies, then it doesn't matter who the lies are coming from. You're fighting for truth. And when your moral system is based on compassion for those who are victimized and standing against those who are doing the victimization, then it doesn't matter who's doing it. You're not going to become a hypocrite by, flipping on that value once your side decides to be in the wrong. So I think very possibly one of the most fundamental lessons that humankind needs to learn is to not associate your sense of identity with something outside yourself that can change. And maybe you're thinking, okay, I haven't supported some big, terrible movement, as far as you can see at this point in time, right? Well, the thing is, just the way human psychology works is it's not like we can really compartmentalize our value systems, right? Like the way you look at the world is going to affect everything that you believe and stand for throughout the course of your life. And it may take time for it to grow to a certain level to where you'd get to the point of being such a blatant hypocrite. But we really have to look at these things where it starts, the seed of these problems. A girl I've been talking to recently is a native Arabic speaker, and she told me, even if it were true, that even if it were proven to her with facts that her form of Arabic that she speaks is actually a separate language from Arabic, that it's actually not Arabic at all. I know this doesn't quite make sense, but it made sense in the context of the conversation we were having, and she kind of misunderstood what exactly the point was about the way that Arabic dialects or other varieties are classified. But the point is, she said, even if it were proven to her that her form of Arabic, Egyptian Arabic, was not Arabic, which it is, but if it were proven that it's not, then she would reject it, she wouldn't accept it, because her sense of identity is associated with being an Arabic speaker. And so it's easier for you to say, okay, I have some kind of things like that, and that's not that big of a deal, right? I mean, it doesn't make a difference. Whether or not I choose to identify as a speaker of a certain language or something, that's not that significant. That's not the point. The point is the underlying value, the principle that if you look at the world in this way, where you are blatantly gonna ignore facts, and even when something is proven to be true, you reject it because you don't want it to be true, and so you'll pretend that it's not, because that's not actual belief, right? We can't really override our beliefs, as far as I know. I'm not capable of doing it. I can't choose what to believe. You can choose to act like something's true that you don't think is true. You can choose to act like something's false when you know it's true. But I don't think you can fake genuine belief. Belief is you've been convinced that something is true or false, okay? And I think if you act in accordance with the belief that something is false when you actually know it's true, or vice versa, you're deceiving yourself. You hurt your trust in yourself, is what the very skilled and experienced and knowledgeable psychologist Jordan Peterson talks about is your brain starts to not trust itself, which causes all kinds of mental problems for you. But also, if you're willing to look at the world that way at all, if truth doesn't matter to you really, if your feelings, your sense of identity associated with something outside yourself matters more to you, then it's just a matter of time until something that you do identify yourself with that's outside of yourself. In her case, she also identifies very strongly as being Egyptian, as being Arab, and those were other things she mentioned alongside it. Like, if it were proven that not the case. So if she were to take a DNA test showing that she doesn't have Egyptian ancestors, then it wouldn't matter. She would reject it and still claim to be Egyptian. And so the point is, if you look at the world that way, there's something that you could identify yourself with either now or in the future, that thing you identify yourself, since it's outside of yourself and you have no control over it, it will go off the rails without you, and you'll end up betraying who you actually are. And ironically, in the process of that, you lose your identity because you're no longer yourself. Because if you're blindly following along with a movement that betrays everything you once said you stand for, who even are you really? It's not you anymore. You've sacrificed your identity to serve some higher group concept, which isn't even accurate because no group is unified. Every person is an individual, including the millions who make up a giant group. They're all individuals with their own ways of looking at things. There will be disagreements. The movements will change over time as a result. So just give up all of that. Think for yourself. Be a maverick, because your identity is simply who you choose to be, which is so much more freeing, so much more moral, so much more logical, so much more reasonable. And since we are all individuals, I think we should stick with the truth and act like it. If we were to have a world where we're all thinking for ourselves, or even just in your, more realistically, a social group you have, where you know fellow people who are like you, and you are all people who think for yourselves and are real about who you are and don't associate your identity with outside things, but only with who you are on the inside, then that's when we can actually get to know each other, actually learn valuable lessons from each other. We can learn and grow and improve together without pressure, feeling like we need to go along with something we don't really believe in due to groupthink pressure. And in the process of that, you will actually form your own unique identity, which is so much more unique, so much more beautiful, and so especially and particularly you. Thank you so very much for taking the time to listen to all these thoughts from this random dude you saw on the internet. I appreciate it very much. I hope you have a good rest of your day. I'd like to remind you to take care of yourself and those in your life, and never forget, you matter. And not because of a label, but because of who you individually really are.